Hey guys, Vincent here from the creativedojo.net. I know it's been a little while since my last tutorial, but rest assured that things have been going on behind the scenes at the dojo. But recently I was playing around with After Effects and Cinema 4D, and I somehow whipped up a really quick animation with some mountains, and it gave a pretty unique look, but it was very easy and fast to create. So I thought I'd share some of the quick tips and tricks that I've used in this particular animation. Pretty easy, pretty interesting, and it should be pretty universal. So before I say any more, I'm going to go ahead and just preview what we're going to be taking a look at today. So a pretty interesting animation. Again, like I said, it was very easy and very quick to create. We have these nice little mountains here, and it kind of just brings in a whole new level for After Effects. Usually we wouldn't be able to animate stuff like mountains and stuff like that within After Effects, but with Element, it was very easy to do. We're going to be taking a look at some camera tricks, camera rigs, some quick color correction, and integrating 3D particles with Element here, as well as just create this overall nice, interesting look within After Effects and Cinema 4D. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Let's go ahead and hop into Cinema 4D here. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a landscape object, just because it's very easy to use and very fast. And we're not really trying to pull off a photorealistic mountain. We're actually just trying to pull a motion graphic looking type of scene. So I think that the landscape object should suffice for this particular animation. So here we have the landscape object. Let's go ahead and make a few tweaks to the parameters. Let's go ahead and definitely increase the size in X. We'll also increase it in Z. We wanted to make it a rather large scene, just because it's going to be a mountain range, and we will also increase the height. And this is looking pretty ugly, but let's go ahead and tweak some of these. Now we can actually apply some contrast to the height of this particular landscape object by changing the sea level and plateau level here. So I'm going to go ahead and tweak those a little bit, and then we can adjust the fine furrows. And we're definitely going to be pulling up the width and depth segment, because we are going to be spending a lot of time up close to these mountains, so I want to give it a little bit more detail so things don't look so rigid. And you don't want to get carried away too much with the segments here, because it will take a little while to render if you add too much. But something like that looks okay to me, in my opinion. Now, if you don't want the look of this particular landscape object, you can go into the random seed here and just play around with the seed until you get a mountain that looks pretty interesting to your likings. You definitely want to find a mountain that will allow you to place something in. Like in the original example, I had a spot for the text. So just go through here and try to find a mountain that that looks like it could be a little useful. So after a little bit of tweaking, I was able to somewhat get a mountain range that I was somewhat satisfied with. And I think I'm going to place the text right in here. So we're going to be doing a basic camera move around the mountain and then showing the object right here. So this is looking pretty good. And now you can actually colorize and texture the mountain range here within Cinema 4D and export that into Element. But in this particular case, I'm just going to leave it as this. Make sure you go to Edit, Preferences, and then go to File, and then make sure you have Save Polygons for Melange, and this will make sure that everything is compatible with exporting for Element. And since Element can read Cinema 4D files straight up, we'll go to File, Save As, and we will call this one Mountain Range and hit Save. And we're pretty much done with the Cinema 4D parts. Let's go ahead and go into After Effects. So here in After Effects, I'm just going to create a new 720p composition. So new composition, we'll call this main comp. We'll make it 1280 by 720, and we'll make it let's 7 seconds long, and change it to 23.976. And now we have a blank composition. So we'll go ahead and create a new element, solid. So we'll go to solid, we'll call this element, and we'll go to Video Copilot and apply element to this element layer. And then the first I'm going to do is go to the scene setup, and we'll go ahead and import our mountain range. So select the mountain range Cinema 4D file that we just created and hit import 3D object. And that's just going to bring our nice model to animate it and add materials to it. So in this particular case, I'm just going to apply a pretty basic preset from the Pro shaders. I'm going to go to the organic presets and select the ICE 02. Drag it in there. It looks pretty nasty at first, so let's go into the parameters and tweak some of it. I'm gonna lower down the diffuse so we don't see the texture as much. And then we'll go to the specular and lower that down. And then lower down the diffuse a little bit. And then we'll just hit OK for now. And now let's go ahead and create our basic camera move. So I'm going to create a new camera, call it camera, and we'll hit OK. And we'll zoom right in. Now, the camera move I want to do is kind of like an orbit. So I want to start maybe around here, and then we'll orbit around the mountain, and then stop right here, show our text or whatever we want to show here, and then kind of slowly orbit around. So you're going to run into a few problems if you just use the camera here, and that's just because After Effects is trying to outsmart itself. So if I just go to the camera here and select P, hold down Shift and select A, we'll get the point of interest and position, and we will set keyframes for that. We'll move maybe 1.5 seconds, and we'll just rotate around. You can see if I do a quick RAM preview, you get this weird camera interpolation here. And that's just because After Effects is trying to take the most efficient route from this point to this point. Because again, it's just kind of reading the numerical values here. So from this point to this point. So what we need to do is create a basic camera rig to execute the kind of rotation that we want. So I'm going to go ahead and delete these keyframes here. I'm going to create 2 null objects. So layer, new, null object. And we'll duplicate the 2. We'll hit F4 or toggle the switches and make them a 3D layer. We'll call this one the arm, which is essentially the arm of the camera, and we'll call this the dolly. And I'm pretty sure there's a technical term for the arm here. I'm just going to call it the arm, which is kind of like the handle that holds the camera. So we're going to, first of all, adjust our camera to the starting position. I'm going to start maybe like right here. And don't worry about the camera too much. We can always go back and adjust it because we're not going to be keyframing the camera. So I'm going to parent the camera to the arm, and I'm going to parent the arm to the dolly null object. And if you don't see the parent column here, just go ahead and right click, go to columns, and enable parent. So right now everything's all linked up together. So as you can see, this is going to be our initial swing. So maybe I should call this swing instead. So I'm going to start here, hit R on the keyboard for the rotation, and I'm going to set a keyframe for the Y rotation. We'll move maybe 1.5 seconds, and we will rotate the camera about right here. So that's going to be our initial swing, and that's when our dolly is going to pick up. So we're going to start maybe at 1 second here. We'll hit R on the keyboard and set a keyframe for the Y rotation as well. And this is going to be our subtle movement. So this is just going to be a kind of like a pan or orbit, a slow orbit. So we'll move around 5 seconds long, and then we'll just rotate it a little bit. So now we have our initial camera swing, and then our dolly picks up, and then it's going to slowly just orbit around so that we can actually have time to view our text but not be so static. So that's our initial camera move. So just like that, we created our camera move without that weird interpolation stuff. And so now we gotta go ahead and tweak some of the keyframes here, because this is actually a very, very boring animation. So what I want to do is create that initial swing. So we're gonna go highlight these keyframes. We're going to right click, go to Keyframe Assistant, Easy Ease or F9. We'll go into the graph editor, and this is a very powerful way to adjust your keyframes. So right now it's just kind of gradually, slowly ease through one point to another. I'm going to select this keyframe here. I'm just going to pull the handle and then pull this one. So what you have is a very, very fast swing initially, and then it's going to slowly slow down here. As you see the slope here, it's going to slowly slow down, and then that's when our dolly is going to pick up, and that's not going to be too much of a problem here. So if I just do a quick RAM preview, you see that you get that initial swing, and then maybe we'll easy ease these keyframes as well, so you get this really nice swing movement. And then everything looks a lot better if we just go ahead and enable the motion blur for the composition and enable the motion blur for element. So we get that nice motion blur to hide all the imperfections. And it really just emphasizes the speed here, so pretty cool. So now that we have the basic animation set up, let's go ahead and create that text right here. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new text in After Effects, and I'm going to call it Frost in this particular case, and we will size it. We'll shut it off because we don't need to see it. We're just going to use it as a custom layer for element. So we'll go to Element, we'll go to Custom Layers, Custom Text and Mask, and select our Frost text. And if we go to Element Scene Setup, we can actually create that 3D text by hitting Extrude, and that's just going to extrude our custom layer. We'll make sure that the extrusion model, which is our text, we'll make sure that it is set to Group 2. And for the bevels, we'll just apply a 3-layer bevel. And then maybe we can make some modifications to this bevel. We'll extrude it a little bit more, push it back, just so we have a thicker bevel. And then for the environment, we'll go to the environment. I actually have a custom sky environment. If you Google it, you can find a lot of nice HDRIs and stuff like that for 3D applications to use. So I'm going to load from file, and here I have my sky file here. So I'm going to select the texture and hit OK. And if we show the environment, you can see what we have here. So I'm going to hit OK. Now this is going to be one of the limitations within After Effects. We can't really create a nice spherical 3D environment within After Effects that easily without some script or some kind of external plugin, which I don't currently have. So we're forced to use the environment here, show and background, and then you can rotate the environment a little bit. But ideally you want to create a separate layer for your background, just because for color correction purposes and stuff like that. But in this case we're kind of limited here, and that will affect us in color correction just a little bit, but I think it should be fine. So we'll just adjust our sky until we get something interesting, and I want to make sure that we end at a interesting spot, so maybe right there. So right now our text isn't showing, and that's probably because for some reason, make sure that your text is selected to Group 2, hit OK, and now we have our gigantic massive 3D text. We'll go into Group 2 and go into the particle look, and we'll just size it down a little bit. And then we want to go to the replicator, which is kind of like the emitter of the text, and we will play around with the position. Now we probably should have normalized this project because everything is kind of in a tight little space, so any little movement in the parameters will be pretty drastic here, but something like that. And now it reacts to our mountains in our 3D environment here. So that is looking pretty good. Of course, we're going to be making a lot of modifications and tweaks to this material, but we'll leave it at that. Let's go ahead and start lighting the scene a little bit. So I'm going to create a few lights. I'm going to create a parallel light. We'll call this one warm light, and we're going to tint it this kind of warm color, and we'll hit OK, and we will go hit P on the keyboard for position, and I'm just going to kind of create this contrast look. I'm going to make the warm light over here, something like that. We'll duplicate it. We'll call this cool light, and we will tint it somewhat blue. I'm not quite sure the kind of look that I'm going for right now, but we will decide that later. And I'll push this one over here on this side just to kind of fill in the extra shadows. So here we have the warm light shining on this side, and then we have the cool light shining on the other opposite side. So we just have a little contrast. And then I want to go ahead and create another backlight for our lens flare in the back. So we'll create a point light, and this will be a cool light in the back. We'll call this one No Light Factory, and we will hit OK. And this one we'll place in the back. You know, maybe right here. You know, something like this, just kind of give it some ambient light. And I think I'm going to create one more light on top, so we kind of have a top light. We're going to create another new light. This time it's going to be a point light, and we'll hit OK. And we're just going to raise this light up a little bit. And that's really going to fill in a lot of the shadows that we had. So now it's starting to look more like an ice mountain. And of course, we're going to tweak some of this later with color correction, but I think overall this is going to give us a very decent look. So now that we have the general scene set up, let's go and take a look at how we can create a more intense and more volumetric environment. And we can do that by creating an atmosphere. So in this particular case, I'm going to create some nice snow particles as well as some cloud particles. And we can do that using particular. So I'm going to go to Layer, New, Solid. And we will call this one Snow. Or let's go ahead and start with Cloud Particles. Hit OK. And we will go to Effect, Trap Code, Particular. And I'm just going to solo this particular layer. And we will focus on the emitter first. We'll go change it from emitter type from point to box. And I'm going to try to go breeze through this part because it's actually very redundant. So we'll go to Particles. We'll change this particle type from sphere to cloudlet. And we'll go ahead and increase the size of the particles. And we will change the opacity way down. And you're going to see that we're going to get somewhat of a cloud look. So I'm going to go ahead and spread out the particles in X. And we'll increase it in Z. So now we have a whole bunch of little cloud particles flying around. And then we also need to go ahead and increase the size to around 79 or so. And we'll go ahead and play around with the size randomness to give some more variation to our clouds. Add some opacity, randomness. And just add some depth here. And we'll change the velocity to about 25. So if we do a quick RAM preview, you can see that we have a whole bunch of smoke just flying around. It will create somewhat of a snowy, cloudy peak top with a lot of atmosphere to our mountain. So we'll unsolo it. It's a little crazy right now, but we'll fix that in a second. We'll tone down the particles per second to around 50, and we will go into the opacity over life, and we're just going to select this one right here. This plateau looking shape, so it's going to fade in and fade out. We'll also turn down the opacity to around 4. And we will go to the emission extras and turn on the pre-run to 100 so that it's going to start the emission before the actual compositions here. So now we have a lot of more intense atmosphere environment to simulate that cloudy look. And then now let's go ahead and create our snow particles. So again, we'll go ahead and create another new solid. Call it Snow Particles. We'll go to Effect, Trap Code, Particular. And we'll also solo this one so we can focus on it. And I'm going to go to the emitter, change the emitter type to box. We'll increase the size in X and increase the size in Z. And then we will go ahead and push the emitter upward. So the emitter is going to emit from the very top of the composition. And we'll go to physics. We'll increase the gravity to about 100. We'll see what that does, and we'll hit play. And that's just going to drive the particles downward like that. And we'll also go into, let's see here, go to the emission extras, turn on the pre-run, turn up the particle amount, and we'll go into the velocity, maybe set it to 80. And then we'll go to particle, tone down the particles to about 3 or so. Increase the opacity randomness as well as the size randomness. And again, we'll change the opacity over life to that plateau shape. So it's going to fade in, fade out. And we'll hit a RAM preview and see what this gives us. And that is looking okay. And if we enable the motion blur, you can see what we have here. And we'll enable the motion blur for the cloud particles as well. And let's take a look. So as you can see, blended in with their scene, we need to increase the opacity, or at least increase the size a little bit. Just a little bit, maybe 5. and then increase the number of particles. So that's looking a lot more intense, looking a lot more violent, especially with that swing. We have all these smoke flying around, all these snow particles flying around. Now, right now, a lot of the particles are not really showing in the depth. Right now, it's all close to the camera, so I need to push the position in Z a little bit. Tweak some of this stuff because right now, we're not seeing much depth. So the goal here is to make it seem as if we have a very, very large environment. So something like that. So right now, if you look at our particles, they're just simply overlaying in front of our element layer. So right now here, let me just shut off the environment. So we'll go to environment, shut it off. Right now, as you can see, we just have a lot of particles flat on top of our mountain here. They're not really incorporated. They're not very blended in. So these clouds are simply just being layered on top of our 3D mountains here. Even though it is a 3D environment, After Effects doesn't have a sense of 3D depth with these two separate layers here. So what we gotta do is we gotta create a ZDepth to incorporate, the front particles, the back particles, particles that show, back in the mountains, the front of the mountains, and we can do this by using a ZDepth. So once you have all your element layers intact, once you have all the general animation intact, we can go ahead and duplicate the element layer. So select the element layer, hit Control Command D, and that's just going to create another instance. So right here in Element, if we go to Output, Element actually has an option to show the ZDepth. So essentially what a ZDepth is, it's kind of information about where the object is towards the camera. So anything very, very close to the camera is white, and everything that's very, very far is either gray or black here. So we just adjust some of the settings. We can show what's near and what's not. And we want to create a lot of variation in tones of gray, so that our particles will be very, very distributed in the depth here. So we want to create variation in shades of luminance. So we have a lot of white here, we kind of have this dark gray here, we kind of start fading off in the back here, and that's just going to give us a cleaner, nicer, more natural composite with our cloud particles here. So now that we have that set up, I'm going to pre-compose this thing. So layer pre-compose. We'll call this one ZDepth and hit OK. And right now you don't see anything because our camera's not in there yet. So I'm going to go ahead and copy the whole camera rig that we created and paste it into the ZDepth composition. So now, as you can see, our ZDepth is moving appropriately, and we're going to have a lot of depth information here. So particular can use that depth information. So I'm going to go ahead and shut off the ZDepth. We don't actually need to see the ZDepth, but the cloud particles can actually use that ZDepth. So we'll go into particular, visibility, and we'll go into the Z buffer and select our ZDepth. And by default, you don't see a difference because, again, these settings are not tuned to our particular project. So right now, I think it's a little bit hard to see what is going on with the ZDepth. So before I continue, let's go ahead and just go back into our element layer, and I'm going to temporarily tint our mountains black. So I'm going to go into the diffuse color, and I'm going to tint our mountains black. So now you can clearly see that even though our cloud particles layer does have some depth, it's simply just overlaying it onto this mountain, so it doesn't look very integrated. So essentially, you don't really get the sense that the smoke layer is behind this rock layer. It's not behind the text. This smoke cloud here is not behind this mountain. These little bumps. These two layers, the particle layer and the element layer, is not reacting together. And the smoke layer is simply just being applied on top of the mountain. There's no integration, there's no variation, and there's no interaction between the two layers. So I'm going to go back to the ZDepth in the cloud particles layer. And now I'm going to start playing with the Z at black and Z at white here. So if we just play around with these things, you can kind of see already that we're getting a lot of depth. Now you want to play with the Z at white as well. And what this is doing is it's kind of adjusting particular and how it reads the ZDepth. So I'm going to keep on adjusting some of it. And now it's starting to, as you can see here, when I move this particular slider down, you can see that this cloud layer here is starting to react to the mountains now. So certain parts of the clouds are being hidden by certain parts of the mountain, and as you can see clearly now, if I move this up, you can see that these cloud particles are now on top of this particular rock. But if we decrease it, you can see now that some of the mountain is actually hiding some of the clouds. And now we have a more integrated shot with the Z-depth here. So if I just shut off the Z-depth first, and if I just turn on the Z-depth again, things are a lot more integrated, as you see here. So as you can see, this big piece of rock mountain here is actually hiding some of the clouds here. So if I just turn it back off, as you can see, just laid on top, and then again with the Z-depth on, it's kind of hiding certain parts of the smoke so that the smoke is more integrated into the scene. And I'm going to just quickly do the same thing to the snow particles so they are all composited in. So now both our cloud particles as well as our snow particles have the Z-depth applied to them, and they are kind of composited into the scene a lot better and reacting to the mountain in a more seamless way. So now we can go back into element and go ahead and turn back on our diffuse color here. So now we're back to normal, and now we can show our background. So now we have a more integrated scene, and we may need to play around with some of the cloud particles just a little bit more, but overall should be pretty seamless. And if I just do a quick RAM preview, you really get a sense of integration with the smoke as well as these nice little snow particles. And that's looking a lot nicer now. Maybe adjust some of the snow a little bit. But overall, that's looking pretty good. I'm going to keep it at that. I don't want to spend too much time tweaking this thing. You can do that on your own. But let me go ahead and apply the final lens flare in the back here. We have this empty light that's not really there for lighting purposes. It's actually there to track our lens flare in the background. So I'm going to go to Layer, New, Solid. We'll call this No Light Factory. And I'm going to go to Effect, No Light Factory, and select Light Factory. And you can use optical flares if you wish. They have the same ability to track to lights. So I'm going to go to Use Lights, and I'm going to go under the source naming to No Light Factory and hit OK. And so now our lens flare tracks to that particular light. And finally, I want to blend this into the scene, and so we're going to toggle the switches and maybe play around with the blending modes. Change it to Add. That's a little bit insane, but we can go into the options and maybe select a more modest flare. So I'm going to select maybe this Helios lens flare. We'll hit OK. And this is definitely a little bit better. We'll go ahead and decrease the brightness a little bit. I mean, I just want to have a little light, and right now it's a little bit blown out. So what we can do is apply an effect, utility, HDR, highlight compression, and that's just going to dim the lights a little bit, the highlights area a little bit. And then we can go to effect, we can go to blur, and then select a fast blur, and we're just going to spread this thing out just a little bit. Actually, I have an idea here. Maybe we can duplicate the element layer, and this one is just going to be the environment. So we're going to go into the scene setup, and we're just going to delete everything in here. So this particular layer here is just going to be the environment, and because we have the camera, it's just going to animate appropriately. This one here, we're going to shut off the environment, so we'll go into render settings, environment, show and background uncheck. So this element layer here is just simply the 3D objects, and this element here is just the environment. So now we have two separate layers. So right now, as you can see, our lens flare is simply being overlaid on top of our mountains. And yes, we could drag the layer underneath our element layer to obscure it, but it doesn't look as nice because of the blending modes. So we're going to keep it, below the cloud particles right here, maybe above the cloud particles. And then we're going to obscure it using the Z-depth. So because the Z-depth is already kind of like a map of our 3D object, and that is the luminance value here, the bright areas, the white areas. We'll go back into our No Light Factory. We'll select our obscuration layer as our Z-depth. Now, this is not really optimal, but since we already have it pre-composed and everything, and we already have the map, And then we will change RGB plus alpha to inverse luminance. So as you can see, it's going to get blocked by our luminance values here. And that's looking a little bit nicer. And then we can maybe crank up the brightness a little bit and maybe tint it a warm color here. So now that we have the basic scene set up, let's go ahead and do some major color correction. I'm going to create a new adjustment layer, and then I'm going to go to Effect, Color Correction Curves, and Effect, Color Correction Tint. We'll shut off the tint for now. So I'm going to go into the RGB, and I'm just going to add a quick contrast S curve. And then I'm going to go into the blue, so I'm going to raise the blue shadows up a little bit. And then lower the highlights down. And then I'm going to go to the red channel and just crank that up a little bit. Like that. We'll go to the green. Maybe raise the highlights. Decrease the shadows. And I guess I'm going for the warm look, so I'm going to call this CC. And then we can go into our environment, and this is the environment of element. We'll go and maybe apply a curves adjustment. Maybe add some contrast to this. And then we'll apply a tint effect to just kind of desaturate it. So now it's a little more warm look. And then we'll go into the element layer, and this is the mountain stuff. We'll apply a curves effect. Maybe add some contrast. Maybe warm it up. And then go ahead and cool the shadows. You know, something like this. I mean, you can do so much with color correction, and I don't want to spend too much time on it. I also want to kind of focus on the center here, so I'm going to crop some of it out. Add some quick letterboxing with the script I made. So apply InstaFilm script. Something like that. And now if we just go ahead and shut off the CC a little bit, you can see it's kind of flat here. We apply this basic warmth to it. And we also applied some color correction to the overall element layer. Now for the finishing touches, in the original example I added some depth of field to it. Now luckily all these 3D particle systems and elements support the built-in camera depth of field. So we can actually go into the camera here, go to camera options, and turn on depth of field. And right now I have a grain layer here created from my InstaFilm script. I'm just going to turn it off because it takes a little while to render. And as you can see, with the depth of field turned on, it looks like a tilt shift kind of effect. It looks very interesting. It looks a lot more focused. And even though you probably wouldn't see this much depth of field on a mountain landscape scene in real life, it kind of gets a more miniature, interesting look. So I'm going to play around with the focal distance. And if we just do a quick RAM preview, I'm just going to adjust my workspace here. I'm going to do a quick RAM preview. So as you can see, with the depth of field turned on, you can kind of hide some of that imperfection. You get a really nice focus, spot focused look towards the text here, and everything just hides all the imperfection and the crazy environment and motion blur and, you know, everything. It just looks a lot nicer and cleaner and more organic. And it just goes to say that all the little things like motion blur and depth of field can really play a huge role in kind of incorporating this 3D model with some of our text here, and just gives it overall a very nice, clean, finished look. Now, one last thing I want to point out is to actually go ahead and I would personally go to the snow particles as well as the cloud particles, go to rendering and go under depth of field. You want to turn off the depth of field, so you don't want to use the camera settings because I feel like the cloud particles are already nice and kind of blurred out already without depth of field on. And then when you turn on the depth of field, it just kind of makes it look messy. As well as the snow particles, you want to keep the snow particles intact, and so we can go into, again, the rendering and maybe just turn off the depth of field just for the snow particles and the cloud particles. We kind of just want the depth of field to apply to the text as well as the mountain because these are like the big objects, but in terms of the particles, I would rather keep the depth of field off, and it's really nice that Trepcode has an option to do that. And lastly, I just want to remind you guys that I did everything in this tutorial pretty fast, and it was very, very rough. I didn't really do that much tweaking. I didn't spend, hardly any time on color correction, and just, I just kind of got all the main ideas to point across. But hopefully when you guys create your own version, hopefully you'll spend more time on the color correction, implementing the mountains a little bit better, focusing on the particles, and definitely play around with the text here. This text here looks a little bit awful, but again, it kind of gets the idea across and everything looks as is. So I kind of gave you guys a general idea on how I made the mountain scene, how I did the camera moves, how I kind of composited everything in and blended things together with motion blur, depth of field, particles. In your render, once you're done working, go ahead and go into the element layer and then go into the, let's see here, go to output and go to sampling and aliasing and go ahead and turn on multi-sampling to maybe 16 and then super sampling maybe to 2, and that's just going to smooth out some of the rigid edges at the very edge here, and this is because Element is trying to save some resources here. But once you're done, go ahead and turn on the multi-sampling to a higher value and super sampling just to smooth out some of these rigid edges here. So overall, this has been a pretty in-depth tutorial. We covered a lot of stuff in a very short amount of time. Hopefully you guys had a lot of fun. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them down below. But overall, that's how you create a very simple and pretty dynamic mountain scene using primarily After Effects and a little bit of Cinema 4D. So once again, guys, my name is Vincent Nguyen from thecreativedojo.net, and I'll see you guys in the next tutorial. Bye, guys.